Like giant exclamation marks, skyscrapers punctuate the story of our urban development.
People always want to reach. There's something heavenly about it, and people have wanted to race for height forever.
Developed by the pioneers of architecture in the late 19th century.
They were, at the time, the equivalent of our going to the moon.
These magnificently designed tower giants urbanized some of the greatest cities in the world.
It's about defying gravity and leaving a sign of humanity.
From Chicago to London, from Tokyo to Dubai, skyscrapers have and continue to define our contemporary way of life.
The reason we want to go higher, I think it's very deep inside us. You know, it's part of our mythology, the Tower of Babel. When you go hiking, you want to see what's over the top of the hill. It's very, very central to our being.
As engineers and architects, it's a great way to show our technological feat to reach the sky.
And it's also a tale of constant evolution, constant improvement, and progress, honestly.
Skylines are the result of technological and urban advancement throughout our world's greatest cities. From generation to generation, we are compelled to build safer, smarter, and higher. And nowhere is this legacy more evident than the windy city of Chicago.
You can look at a place like Los Angeles, which is known for its entertainment industry. You can look at New York, which would be finance. Miami would be fashion. And Chicago really is architecture. Part of the great thing the architecture community has done is to always build differently. So everything is sort of a riot of different styles and different eras. Everything holds up.
In the mid-19th century, Chicago grew exponentially as people migrated to the Midwest seeking new opportunities.
Chicago was the first modern city. It's the first city to be conceived in a modern way. And Chicago had the fortuitous, but also the infamous start because of the fire.
A great fire struck the sprawling lakeside town of Chicago and threatened to wipe its very name off the map.
And the fire basically destroyed everything in Chicago, which at that time was simply wood frame buildings. But it had the opportunity to really think anew about the city and what it means to build in a modern way.
Within 6 weeks after the fire, 300 new buildings were on the rise.
Some of Chicago's new buildings were the first skyscrapers, marking a new departure in architecture.
When the sort of phoenix rises from the ashes, it's architecture that saves Chicago.
And what happened in Chicago, by destroying all of that city center acreage, it gave the opportunity for architects who lived in Chicago, but also architects who lived elsewhere and needed work, to come to Chicago.
And this is after the Civil War. Guys like Daniel Burnham, William Barangeni, they knew how to put a bridge up very quickly out of whatever they could find.
Architecture as a profession didn't exist, so it was engineers who did buildings. They had a wide variety of influences, but they were neoclassically trained architects who had either studied abroad or had been studying on the East Coast at schools like MIT.
The city became a training ground for up-and-coming architects, a talented group of individuals known as the first Chicago School.
These early pioneers in Chicago were very pragmatic individuals, businessmen, commerce-driven. Chicago always has been, and presumably always will be.
The famed Chicago School, a group of architects, commercial architects, business architects designing business buildings for businessmen, also had a kind of mantra or ethic about pragmatism, about an American character for their buildings.
Between 1880 and 1890, Chicago's population doubled to more than 1 million. But land in the city, specifically in the Loop area, was limited, so real estate prices skyrocketed. Property owners, having paid close to $1 million for their quarter-acre slice of the city, needed to capitalize on their investments. The city had nowhere to go but up. In the 1880s, the home insurance building was the tallest in Chicago's business district, an important architectural landmark until its demolition in 1931.
The home insurance building is widely considered the world's first skyscraper because the walls of the building were liberated from any structural role. And that meant the entire kind of structural weight of the building was taken with a lightweight metal frame.
Chicago's first building featured load-bearing walls made out of brick and stone. Buildings supported by fireproof metal frames distributed the weight of each floor more evenly, so walls could be considerably thinner. Bessemer steel, which is more flexible than cast iron, made significant advancements in structural engineering. Streetcars, railways, and subways contributed to the changing urban landscape, transporting working professionals from suburban neighborhoods to centralized locations in the city.
You know, before you had those structural frames, you could only go as high as those thick masonry laws would let you go because your walls would be so thick. Once steel was invented as a way to hold essentially a skyscraper, all of a sudden you had the ability to open up those floors to real estate and go up.
The home insurance building was built in 1885. Its old-school exterior blended in with the streetscape. Standing tall at 12 stories high, it was designed by William LeBaron Jenney, the father of the American skyscraper.
And there's an interesting story about his inspiration. He was at home, and his wife had brought in lunch.
And she put a real heavy book on this bird cage. And you'd think, well, you know, that the thing would crash. But then he realized that this so-called cage construction, you can put a lot of weight on without having heavy walls on the outside.
So really the two key technologies were the steel, which allowed buildings to go much higher in a way that hadn't been possible using masonry load-bearing walls, and the elevator, which was able to transport these people.
Steel frame construction made buildings stronger than ever before, but it wasn't until Elisha Graves Otis revealed his transportation idea that technological advancements were able to lift skyscrapers to daring new heights.
Elisha Graves Otis was born in 1811 in Vermont. He was a known inventor. It's one uncommon belief is that he invented the elevator. He actually invented the safety brake, which made elevators safe. The safety brake, he mounted a spring connected to the hoist rope. In the event of a failure, there were ratchets that were mounted to the sides. If it lost tension, it would enact the ratchets to close and clamp down on the guide rails, stopping the elevator in motion, thus keeping the elevator from plunging to the ground. At the World Fair, he brought the full elevator into the building, and then he got on himself. As the crowd gathered, he took an axe and cut the hoist rope. The crowd gasped, but the elevator did not collapse because the safety mechanism worked, clamped to the sides, stopped the elevator from free-falling, and he announced, all safe.
Until the 1880s, let's say, the top floors were the worst floors, were the least desirable floors because people had to travel up the stairwells to get to those places. And then when they introduced the elevator, after the Civil War, elevators became common technologies in office buildings, hotel buildings. Then that changed the dynamic, and people were really interested in working on the higher floors.
So all of that infrastructure came at around the same time, and once it was in place, the buildings just started growing enormously.
The Reliance building in Chicago is a more interesting example of what was the beginning of skyscrapers, because it used steel probably to a larger extent, and the concept of having a rigid frame or a braced frame that was able to stabilize itself against the wind was more evident.
With its steel superstructure, the Reliance building in Chicago was a flawless representation of the Chicago School of Construction. Designed by Daniel Burnham and Charles Atwood, the 16-story commercial tower was the first skyscraper to use large sheets of plate glass that made up the majority of the building's surface area. Apart from reducing the overall weight and cost of the building, the glass increased the building's overall efficiency.
If you have bigger glass, you can have more light coming into the building, and therefore you can get more efficiency, productivity from the workers in the building.
At this time, there was no air conditioning systems. There were electric lighting was incandescent lighting. So natural ventilation and daylight were really important in these early office buildings.
The Chicago School's solution to the light and ventilation problem was eventually resolved through the development of the Chicago window, a large fixed plane of plate glass with movable sidelights. As the Chicago School became pioneers of both innovation and collaboration, they were forced to search for new ways to solve complex problems. In the late 19th century, a new era of structural engineering was born. Using the principles of the Chicago School of Architecture, these American pioneers of design inspired a new wave of possibilities, one of which was the skyscraper, the increased availability of steel, the invention of the elevator safety brake, and the use of plate glass windows allowed structural engineers to dream bigger, stronger, and higher.
Another aspect of the Chicago School was, I think, the significance of the relationship between the engineer and the architect. The engineer was entirely incorporated into that firm.
Another concept attributed to the Chicago School was the idea that form follows function, that the shape of a building should relate to its function and purpose.
This artistic expression of the skyscraper was married to an idea about what an American ethic was, not something recognizably appropriated from European tradition, but something that was Native American became a kind of theory or ideology of the Chicago School.
You really have to stand back and appreciate just what the architects have sort of done over 100+ years, what they've really given us.
In 1893, economic depression hit the U.S. Financial panic started in New York, but quickly spread across the rest of the country. 500 banks closed their doors. 15,000 businesses folded. Surplus office space in Chicago led to the council backing a plan that helped those in the real estate game counter their diminishing profits. They imposed a limit on the height of any new buildings in the business district, effectively flatlining the skyscraper boom that was keeping the heart of the city alive. Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. were also affected by the panic. But New York's developers and investors remained confident. The real estate market may have chilled, but the skyscraper industry refused to be put on ice.
So my reading of the 1893 panic as it influenced sort of New York City's real estate market was they couldn't really stop this juggernaut, which was the growth of New York City, growth of the modern American metropolis. New York City has always been a merchant city. It always had an eye towards commerce.
It's the East Coast nexus, but also the European nexus of connections for trade, as it had been all through the 19th century. And so by the 1870s, New York is almost 1 million population, and it is a driving engine of capitalism.
In 1892, the local building code, which required the use of masonry for fireproofing, had changed, allowing New York builders to follow Chicago's lead and implement steel frame construction.
And then that created vast quantities of new real estate, which further produced economic growth and attracted more businesses. And then you have these sort of positive feedback cycles where new growth generates more growth.
Manhattan's skyline was evolving, but the city experienced many harsh critiques. But none were as polarizing as the criticisms Daniel Burnham received for the Flatiron Building.
In a city that is defined by the grid in Manhattan, here we have a triangular building which is informed by the diagonal of Fifth Avenue.
The New York Times called it a monstrosity, a stingy piece of pie, the greatest inanimate troublemaker in New York.
Its architecture is in a way like a Greek column with a base, a shaft of multiple stories, and a capital, the kind of decoration at the top of the building.
Shaped like a right-angled triangle, its prow measured 6 feet wide. The Flatiron Building towered over the street at 285 feet tall, a daring departure from the heavy block-like base structures that typically gave tall buildings at that time an aura of stability.
It was also about incorporating those technologies of stiff frames and rigid construction, because it was a fairly slender building for those days. So it demonstrated the essence of what a skyscraper needs to do structurally as well.
Even though engineers were confident in their design, critics believed that the building created a dangerous wind tunnel and could possibly knock the building down.
There was also an episode where apparently a courier was washed away from the footpath as a result of the wind hitting the tower, coming down the facade and sweeping through the footpath. And this poor boy was then killed by an automobile that was coming on the street. So it gives this sense that skyscraper also had an impact on their surroundings.
While many New Yorkers were curious about the windy controversy around the Flatiron, others were captivated by the building itself, igniting the city's passion for architecture and a distinctive sense of style.
Flatiron Building is an interesting case. Certainly Daniel Burnham designed the Flatiron Building, but I think that the iconography of the Flatiron Building is decisively New York.
The Flatiron was probably historically, in the historiography of architecture, was one of those moments where suddenly the impact of a tall building on the city was realized. But there was also this postcard quality of the building that you could just use to say, hey, this is New York. Look at that.
The Flatiron became the most talked about building of its time, inspiring masses of architects and engineers in their quest to build to the sky. In America, in the early 20th century, a new wave of innovative building construction burst onto the scene. These advancements in technology allowed designers and architects to take more risks, which led to a new phase in skyscraper building.
In the heyday, the golden age of the skyscraper of America, there was this incredible self-confidence. They're about pride and they're about doing something well and something that will endure over time.
Throughout time, humans have always tried to reach for the sky. From the beginning of their invention to today, skyscrapers have been built as visual representations of a city's growth, a country's power, and a symbol of success for the individual who developed them.
We always try to reach for the sky.
Because people are ambitious. We have something called human spirit.
Why do people climb mountains? Why the quest for flight, to defy gravity, to ascend? I think it's human nature.
As engineers, building high up is fun, it's innovative, and it also gives us a challenge and an opportunity.
I grew up in suburbia. I know what it's like. You drive in a car, houses are spread apart. So the idea of compacting the way that we live is a huge positive. And, the skyscraper going up is a big part of how we compact a city.
Today we have cities that are megacities, populations that exceed 20 million people, and they're growing. Tall buildings in that respect have become almost a necessity rather than an option.
So if you and I want to live in the same piece of land, the only way we're going to be able to do that is by living above or below each other. So it's the same thing with renting office space. If everybody wants to be in a particular market, there's enough demand to build up.
The most basic reason is profit. And that equation will never change. Total development value less total cost equals developers' profit.
At the turn of the century, skyscrapers were beginning to dominate the Manhattan skyline. The city and its population were rapidly growing. As more and more immigrants began to settle in America, The Lower East Side had become the most densely populated region in the city.
Well, I would say in parallel to the growth of businesses was the need for transportation innovations and transportation and infrastructure investments. So the Brooklyn Bridge becomes one of the first key attempts to sort of link Brooklyn with Lower Manhattan and allow for people to kind of commute and walk over the bridge, and it eliminated the ferry. And then by the turn of the 20th century, New York City starts building its famous subway system.
Construction above ground could barely keep up with the number of people migrating to the city. Everyone wanted a piece of the Big Apple and its promise of wealth and opportunity. New York soon became known as the city of skyscrapers.
In the heyday, the golden age of the skyscraper America, there was this incredible self-confidence. They're about pride, and they're about doing something well and something that will endure over time.
As architects and engineers became more familiar with requirements of the city, buildings became more sophisticated. These bold pioneers of design were fearless. The Singer Manufacturing Company was one of the first to inspire architectural change. At the time, the Singer Tower was projected to be the tallest building in the world.
These buildings are done a floor a week. It's astonishing. And then quickly clad in terracotta of some kind. You can just imagine somebody looking at this and looking at a floor a week and having a building occupied in a matter of months, which is absolutely staggering.
Ernest Flagg, the architect who designed the Singer Tower, was one of the most outspoken champions of urban building reform. He believed that skyscraper towers more than 10 to 15 stories high should be set back from the street, allowing the lower levels of the building to occupy only 1/4 of the lot. At 612 feet high, Singer's new corporate headquarters building was revered by critics as the boldest expression of New York's architectural construction. But shortly after the groundbreaking building opened its doors in 1908, it soon lost its spot as the world's tallest building, as new architects and engineers began to push the design envelope. A year later, the Metropolitan Life Tower in Lower Manhattan became the new frontrunner. The building's architect, Napoleon Lebrun, believed style was more important than innovation, that tall buildings should reflect longevity and stability. With its slender column, high-pitched roof, and domed lantern, the MetLife Tower was seen as an architectural gem and became a symbol of the company's success.
Today, we recognize these crowns as an element of the skyline. It's also a symbolic representation of what the city is about.
So the buildings did advertise themselves. They advertised the business, but they also accommodated the growing population of workers that needed to be at the city center.
When New York was first colonized, people's place of home and work were essentially the same. They might have had their shop down on the ground floor, but they lived upstairs. And then over time, as neighborhoods evolved, people didn't necessarily want to live where they worked. So the minute you segregated work and home, you started developing an office culture.
This new societal shift made skyscrapers a lucrative investment and would boost behemoths of industry like MetLife to become even more profitable. By the end of the 19th century, the MetLife Insurance Company became the largest insurer in the United States. Due to its rapid growth, the MetLife Insurance Company Tower was commissioned to serve as the company's new headquarters in Lower Manhattan. To some, the decision to move the company north of the business district seemed like a bold move, but the decision proved to be a success. By 1905, when the MetLife building needed additional space, the company found it most cost-effective to purchase tenants' leases. Vice President Haley Fisk, who worked as an attorney for the company's insurance department, took an interest in the skyscraper. Mr. Fisk called it an advertisement that didn't stand the company a cent because the tenants footed the bill.
Cass Gilbert gave us the moniker of the skyscraper as the machine that made the land pay. And the Wharf building was called the Cathedral of Commerce. Such was this tie to economics, to finance, kind of gave rise to its construction.
By 1910, the Woolworth Company drew up plans for a headquarters building. Surpassing the 700-foot MetLife Insurance skyscraper, the Woolworth building soon outranked its predecessor.
Woolworth got this idea of merchandise should sell itself. And then he invented this idea of the 5 and dime store, where everything in there was a nickel or a dime. And he didn't require the salespeople to be gifted at salesmanship. All they had to do was ring up the cash register. So it was just a wholly different concept of selling. He didn't immediately come to the idea of having this biggest skyscraper in the world. But then the Singer building went up, and then later on the Metropolitan Life building was built. So he decided that I got to have a building bigger than they had.
Sitting on one of the most prominent corners in downtown Manhattan, Woolworth had built himself an extravagant trophy building. Complete with a grand arcade entrance, marble walls and floors, Tiffany elevator doors, and 29 elevators, the building had opulent features.
And so the rise of the skyscraper through the sort of companies that put up those very, very tall ones in the early part of the 20th century, spoke to who was controlling things at that time.
At its completion, the 792-foot, 58-story building ended up costing close to $13.5 million to produce. Woolworth paid for the building in cash.
The most important thing to understand about tall building under construction, it's almost, imagine a reverse engineering of the assembly chain. Where you have machinery and product that moves across, and you have workers always doing the same thing in the same place. In a tall building, it's a different dynamic, where you have someone doing always the same thing, but moving in space in a corkscrew fashion. So you constantly move from place to place on the floor, and then from one floor to the other.
They must have wire cables for nerves.
We see these photographs of them wandering along these steel beams, which are truly terrifying. But we must realize also the nature of fixing steel beams, which didn't involve any scaffolding, was to rivet them with hot rivets.
The beams had to be lined up, and then the rivets had to be, of course, heated up on site on a furnace, thrown to a catcher, then fed into a hole, then had to be kept in place on one side, punched on the other. Then the rivet would shrink and keep the steel together. So you can imagine the amount of labor involved, the amount of risk and safety associated with that.
I mean, they had all kinds of safety procedures, but you're working in certain places where the building is just steel girders and so on and so forth, and it's possible to fall off.
And if you think walking along a dry steel beam is dangerous, imagine what it must have been like in even a light breeze and a drizzle coming down to walk along a slippery beam in a 100-story building.
Many New Yorkers viewed skyscrapers as inspirational monuments that represented a city's prosperity. But others saw them as unnecessary monsters that challenged the beauty and essence of the city. Yet only a select few stirred up quite a controversy. Located in the heart of Manhattan's financial district, the Equitable Life Assurance Building was considered one of the most groundbreaking skyscrapers of the century. With its skeletal steel frame, lightweight fireproof construction, and passenger elevators, the building was considered an engineering first. Famously known as the first office building.
The Equitable building, which is still existing today and functioning, is basically a sort of a U-shaped building that took a whole block, city block, and it was built like a monolithic rectilinear shape.
Here was a 40-story building, with a vertical extrusion of a floor plate, which created a massive hulking block.
And people didn't like it because it started casting shadows on several blocks around it, depending on the time of day. So people went out and really demanded for air and light in their streets.
And for many people, this was enough. And this ushered in a very famous piece of legislation called the 1916 New York Zoning Law.
The Zoning Act of 1916 imposed a mathematical formula for how tall a building could rise before it was forced to become progressively narrower. Only when a building's upper footprint was reduced to 25% of its lot size on the ground could remaining floors stretch as far as developers wanted.
So New York had still retained this idea that you could build into the skies. You could build as tall as you wanted, but only on a portion of the land.
Due to tiered skyscrapers, Art Deco-style buildings began to rise in popularity. The Barclay Vesey Telephone Building was credited with being the first skyscraper to use zoning resolution to its designing advantage. In doing so, the Barclay was also the first group of architects and engineers to incorporate Art Deco motifs into the building's ornamentation. Art Deco flourishes were used to accentuate the building's dimensions, adding to the aesthetic that would become a hallmark of the setback style. The decade infamously dubbed the Roaring Twenties was a period of economic prosperity with a distinctive cultural edge. Anyone in the real estate game was taken along for the ride.
And so by the early, mid-1920s, the business climate is improving, and there's this tremendous real estate shortage, both for housing and for offices. And so the real estate community in New York City, for example, really turned to a project of massive building.
A quarter of the financial district in New York was rebuilt, adding over 16 million square feet of office space into the mix. The situation in Chicago was no different. Commercial properties were in short supply, and rents had gone through the roof. City planners lifted existing height restrictions, allowing Chicago to rejoin the race to build to the sky. Once again, the city was caught in what historian Merrill Schleer called skyscraper mania.
These things are immortalized in so many tourist snapshots all around the world.
Trinkets that someone's selling, T-shirts, all of these things, and those are great, and people get excited about them, and I think they always will.
Skyscraper mania reached its peak when design proposals for the Chicago Tribune Tower were made into a competition.
The owner of the Chicago Tribune, Colonel Robert McCormick, wanted something that would be a tribute to him, something grandiose. And so he had this competition for a design of the building.
The prize money offered was $100,000. Today, that's nearly $1.5 million. Hundreds of architects submitted designs, hoping to make a name for themselves.
Some are whimsical, some are farcical, and some of those, done by European modernists, harken back to the first Chicago school, being minimalist, no ornament at all, which is not really what American architects were doing in the 1920s.
Ultimately, two New York-based architects won, Raymond Hood and John Mead Howells. Hood and Howells' Gothic revival design appealed to McCormack's traditional values, the substantial space it enveloped, his commercial acumen. Famous quotations from Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson lined the lobby walls, while the facade was adorned with fragments of stone collected by Tribune reporters from significant sites around the world.
The story goes that he had his stringers in the different cities, as part of their job, send him these bits and pieces early on to embed in the lower levels, just prove that, he's got connections everywhere.
To say the Roaring Twenties were socially notorious in America is nothing short of an understatement. A new culture was emerging in the country, centered in downtown New York. New York became entertainment central. It was an exciting time to be living and working in New York City, and corporations were tripping over themselves for a prestigious address. In the late 1920s, the Woolworth Building was still the tallest on Manhattan's skyline, inciting two other giants of industry into action. Car magnate Walter Chrysler and Wall Street hotshot George Orstrom, spurred on by their equally competitive architects. Each party sought to outdo the other, aspiring to exceed the Woolworth Building and the world's tallest structure, the renowned Eiffel Tower in Paris.
Walter Chrysler saw the Chrysler Building as part of a pet project, part of a way to express his wealth and his business acumen, if you will.
Walter Chrysler proudly referred to his building as a monument to me. The 77-floor tower reflected both the status of its owner and the very essence of New York. But this era of limitless possibility wouldn't last. New York's metropolitan population exceeded 10 million by the early 1930s. In an era characterized by social and technological change, consumer goods, such as the automobile, became icons of the American dream. In the early 20th century, William Van Allen met his architect partner H. Craig Severance. Both had a lot in common in regards to architectural design, which included new styles that leaned towards modernism. By the late 1920s, Van Allen was contracted to work on one of the tallest buildings in the world, the Chrysler Building. His design proposal epitomized Art Deco style. It was bold and undeniably beautiful. Its friezes looked like hubcaps, and the stainless steel gargoyles, the eagle-headed hood ornaments on the 1929 Chrysler Plymouth. The proposed completion height of the Chrysler Building was a carefully guarded secret, changing constantly during construction, forcing Orstrom's architect, Craig Severance, to pile floor after floor onto his building just to stay in the race.
It was transition towards the big gesture that becomes the symbol of the building. It's dominating the skyline. It's the beginning of a super tall culture.
It's the first to top the Eiffel Tower in height, the first building to exceed 1,000 feet in height. So this is amazing.
The tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange in market prices.
You have the Roaring Twenties, and there is a sense of euphoria, and there's a sense of kind of limitless possibility. But then the stock market crashes, and people in New York, they're not quite sure what's going to happen. There's this kind of wait-and-see attitude, because they've experienced recessions before. They've experienced downturns before. By the end of 1929, the office vacancy rates around Wall Street were practically zero.
Real estate speculators had invested heavily in skyscrapers during the Roaring Twenties. When the stock market crashed, there were literally dozens of major buildings underway in New York, so there was little choice but to complete them. 11 months after the Chrysler Building was completed, it was outshined by the eighth wonder of the modern world, the Empire State Building. Designed by William F. Lamb, it was commissioned by Empire State Incorporated, a group of wealthy investors that included John Jacob Raskin, Vice President of General Motors.
One of the builders of the Empire State Building said, building a skyscraper is the closest peacetime equivalent to war, which is a pretty powerful statement. What he meant was that all efforts, all materials, all goods and flows, labor are sort of focused on one objective, which is to build this building. You could imagine the roads were shut down, trucks were bringing in material. Everything was sort of focused on this war effort.
There she is, the Empire State Building, 102 stories high.
The 223-foot mooring mast on the Empire State was a late addition to the building, easily making it the tallest building in the world, a position it held right up until 1972. It was the first skyscraper to exceed 100 stories, a truly monumental structure that took up an entire city block.
The Empire State Building was built during the Great Depression, and so how is that possible? If you think about it, we could not build a building like that today. And that has sort of been burned into our collective, imagination of what a city is and what New York is.
The Wall Street crash of 1929 led to the Great Depression and inevitably brought the tall building boom in New York to an end. The situation was similar in Chicago. Adding insult to injury, developers took a wrecking ball to the hallowed home insurance building. LeBaron Jenney's vision for the longevity of uniquely Chicago-style school buildings was crushed along with the rubble. His dream for future generations was that they would be able to read the feelings and aspirations of those cutting-edge architects and engineers who erected them.
One skyscraper alone is not very interesting, but the minute you see an assemblage of skyscrapers that start to make a place from a distance that you can identify because they together represent this mass of humanity that has somehow managed to live in such close proximity so successfully for such a long period of time.
Skyscraper is the most public piece of architecture. The public in the sense that the public feels a connection to the skyline in a way that they don't feel a connection to, say, the single-family house. But the idea of the skyline as that's my skyline, that's a kind of really powerful idea.